it's the story which is ridiculously pathetic. You need this filter, as it were, distantiating filter to make the story palpable. And I claim, again, the same goes for this Gangnam Style. First, and I think I'm not, I mean it quite seriously. When I say that this is the way, the mode of today's spiritual experience, if you want, I'm not making fun of it. My claim is not it's a pseudo-spiritual experience. Of course, I find it disgusting, but my thesis, underlying thesis, is much more radical. It's that what if a spiritual experience itself can be disgusting, even if it's authentic? I mean, why do we automatically associate inner spiritual experience with something, I don't know, morally elevating and so on and so on? My idea was always, for example, when I read, they're horrible reading, of course, Nazi or other memoirs. What if why automatically, if someone does something horrible in real life, organized murder, torture, and so on, why do we automatically assume that he must be somehow non-authentic, hypocritical in his inner life? This is, I know, very sad news, pessimist news, but I'm more and more convinced of it. Now, let me present you, as part of this line of thought, another experience which brought me a lot of hatred in my own country. Already, I developed this in some of my books, where I proposed the line of, like, no ethnic cleansing without poetry. Literally. You know why I took this path? Because I got a little bit tired with this eternal motive, which you find from Levinas to Adorno, all of them, or even many generally people of culture, of blaming us philosophers. You know, the idea is political totalitarianism. For example, Emmanuel Levinas says this clearly. Political totalitarianism is grounded in philosophical notion of totality. You think you have access to total, absolute knowledge, you know totality, and this justifies you then to brutally impose your vision on reality. I claim, okay, maybe, although I doubt it deeply. Deeply. Because if you look closely, now at a naive, empirical level even, if you look closely at most of, not even most of actual so-called totalitarianisms, you will see that the spontaneous ideology of totalitarianism is always historicist relativism, you know. For example, if there was someone who was not philosophically totalitarian, it's Adolf Hitler. Read Mein Kampf. It's a horrible book, pretty boring, but it's worth reading. Because you see that his attitude was not man master of universe. His attitude was man is just a tiny dust of nature. We are totally exposed to nature. We will perish, disappear, and so on. It's total historicist relativism, and so on and so on. So what I'm saying is then, why, even I had some problems with, even with theorists of deconstruction, who also claim that kind of a metaphysics of identity sticking to absolute values, again, in some way grounds totalitarianism and so on. Now, look, for example, at the time of the French Revolution, and you will see that the defenders of ancien regime were historicists. They claim we have, you know, their line was the one of, how is he called, the great critic of French Revolution, Edmund Burke, or who? Burke, yeah. You know, the idea is we all live within a certain particular tradition which is ultimately contingent, but the worst thing we can do is to just relativize this tradition which is contingent and impose some eternal values and so on. It was the revolutionaries who were much more metaphysical, in the sense that no, there are natural rights of man. If anything, the conflict between Burke and partisans of French Revolution was the conflict between a historicist and kind of a absolutist, no eternal values, natural rights, and so on. Here, I think, it's a nice example of how precisely the reference to an absolute can open up the space of freedom. But let me go on with this idea, ethnic cleansing and so on. Let me be serious now. I'm not crazy. Don't be afraid. I mean, there are poets who really are poets. They are absolute. I mean, but not so many as people think. Like, I don't know, in the 20th century, if you mention, I don't know, Paul Celan or whatever. But did you notice, nonetheless, how many of undoubtedly great modernist poets were pretty close to fascism or whatever? Eliot, what is my trauma here? This one. It's very simple line of thought. We are basically half decent people, as I already developed it, I think, the first evening there. And it's difficult for us to kill someone and so on. So you need some kind of absolute mythic, poetic, religious vision, again, to function as a screen, to make it possible. Here I agree, partially, not totally. I'm not part of that today's materialism of Harris and Hitchens and so on. But I basically agree with what Steven Weinberg, I think, said somewhere, that without religion, bad people would be doing bad things and good people good things. You need something like religion to make good people do bad things. I can tell you that this is what happened in my own country, for example. You know the story, ex-Yugoslavia, ethnic cleansing, and so on. I think it's not an accident, a chance that the leader of Bosnian Serbs is Radovan Karadzic, a poet. And I'm not blaming just the Serbs. If you look at other ex-Yugoslav republics, every nation had its own Karadzic. You need this type of a vision to enable you to do the horrors. What do I mean by this? It's interesting to read, I always quote it, what Heinrich Himmler, you know, the SS boss, he confronted this problem. Like, he knew very well, it's interesting to read him, he knew very well that SS officers and soldiers were obliged to do horrible things while doing, while organizing Holocaust, bringing together all the Jews. You had to beat children, women, and so on and so on. And his problem was how to enable German soldiers or SS, the elite soldiers, to do this without, as he himself put it, Himmler, without becoming beasts, like beasts in the sense of simply enjoying, getting involved in what they are doing. You maybe know what his solution was, Bhagavad Gita, Oriental wisdom. Himmler always had in his pocket a special leather-bound version of Bhagavad Gita. Of course, his focus was, you must know, Bhagavad Gita, that famous encounter between Arjuna, the warrior, and God, Krishna, no? Just before the big battle, Arjuna is on the battlefield with tens of thousands of soldiers, opposing army, and has doubts. My God, do I have the right to order the attack? Thousands will die, and so on, all the suffering. And then God basically gives him a nice lesson of this famous act without being fully involved, no? And of this, what we in the West identify, that's another point. Does it really hold or not as Oriental ontology? He says, but material reality are just appearances. Things grow, disintegrate, disappear. The true reality is the reality of your eternal self, Atman, which is eternal. So the logical conclusion, don't worry, do all the killing and so on. What you can destroy, it's already in itself negligible, deserves to perish, and so on and so on. And precisely, again, don't get involved. And it's really shocking how, if you look, for example, I made a test and looked also at Rwanda. Of course, there is a poet there who for 10 years was laying the ground, the foundation for Tutsis killing the Hutus and so on and so on. I'm not far from condemning poetry. I think that precisely authentic poetry is the best medicine against this, for undermining national myths and so on and so on. But again, I think that precisely, how should I put it? I don't believe in cynicism in the sense of that people can be totally cynical. I claim that nobody can be totally cynical. Each of us has his or her or their own small island of authenticity, as it were, you know. And here again, poetry is needed. You know where poetry enters? Ideological poetry, of course. The most terrifying trick of this poetic justification of violence is a very specific one. Himmler also knew it. They admit, for example, let's go back to that situation that I evoked the first evening here, using you, Matthew, I think, as the example. Let's say I am ordered to kill you. Okay, unfortunately, I'm not perfect. I will have some problems, no? But then the trick is a good totalitarian propaganda, not propaganda, mythology, admits this trouble of mine. Of course, we have, most of us at least, some basic decency. It's disgusting, difficult for us simply to approach another guy, pick out his eyes, cut off his testicles, whatever. But then, you know what does it do, authentic totalitarian poetry? It redefines your very problem with doing this as an ethical problem temptation, in the sense of, as Himmler said, most of the people can do great things for their country, even sacrifice their lives. A true hero is the one who is ready to lose his soul for the country, to do horrible things for his fatherland. So, you know, like, if I have, sorry, don't take it personally, it's just history. If I have to torture and kill you, the trick would have been to say, of course you feel horrible, but the true greatness is to elevate yourself above this temptation of ordinary humanity. Precisely what you, in your everyday awareness, experience as ethically problematic is the weakness. A true hero, a true ethical greatness is when, for a higher cause, you are ready to act beyond good and evil, and so on and so on. And here, you need some poetic vision. I cannot call it otherwise. Vision of, I don't know, national destiny, religion, call it whatever you want, to make them do that. Okay, so again, this would be my first pessimist lesson of how, and at the end I will come to Buddhism again, which I already mentioned the first thing, precisely because I think that here, and I spoke with many Buddhists, and even mostly they agreed that here there is a problem in Buddhism, namely that the really difficult thing for us to admit is that there is no necessary inner link between ordinary goodness towards others, doing kind things, and so on, and let's call it naively authentic spiritual experience. Maybe you know the story, which I like to repeat. I'm sorry if you know it. I wrote about it long ago, 20 years ago, in a book. I wrote about a book which I like very much by Aldous Huxley. Maybe you know it, The Grey Eminence, L'Eminence Grise. It's a biography of Father Joseph, Père Joseph, who was a priest and the right hand of Cardinal Richelieu, the de facto ruler of France during the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. And you know what is so crazy about this guy? If there ever was an evil politician, it's Father Joseph. To cut a long story short, if we engage in some mythical genealogy and try to guess what's the origin of Hitler, of World War II, it's Father Joseph. You know why? This was the battle between Catholics, Protestants for Europe. But Cardinal Richelieu had no illusions. He knew it's not really about that. It is about about establishing central role of France in European politics, and the way to do it is to prevent German unification. And so, Father Joseph, who executed this plan, did something totally unprincipled. He, although this was officially a war of Catholics against Protestants, he made a pact with Swedish Protestants against Austrian Catholics, just to keep Germany divided. And this is the logic I was referring to. Because Germany was divided, because Germany constituted itself as a nation state too late, everybody knows that this delay caused First World War, and then it's the ultimate cause, and then of Second World War. But what I'm like to say is that, okay, here we have a guy who was at this level really, really evil, organizing murders, extortions, torture, name it. Now comes the horrible thing. At the same time, this guy was in a permanent communication, exchanging letters with some nunnery, women's convent, how do you call it, and he wrote them the most authentic, beautiful, mystical reflections. At the top level, name it, like who are the big hits, Saint Teresa or John of the Cross, it's at that level. It's absolutely authentic spirituality. And that's what, it's not a really great book, but this is the nice point. This is what bothers so much Aldous Huxley. How can a guy who is doing all this, at the same time, how can he write something that you cannot but say, if you are honest, my God, this is the pearl, the thing itself. This is it. And we can go on here, like Heydrich, you know, we are back to Himmler. His second man who organized the Wannsee Conference Holocaust. I was quite traumatized. I read in a history of SS, that Heydrich was, of course, German elite, relatively educated. Privately, he played very well violin, and in the evenings, he used to gather with his SS friends, and they have some kind of amateur constituted string quartet, and they like to play what is, my God, unfortunately I must tell you, is generally admitted one of the top achievements of Western music, late Beethoven's string quartets. Now, I found this to be some kind of, let me call it, ontological scandal, you know. Like, how is this possible? This is not just that not even scum, a totally evil man like Heydrich, you know. Again, the one who organized planned Holocaust can maybe authentically enjoy, appreciate such beautiful music.